Our next speaker is Dr. Rebecca Grais. She is Director of Research at Epicenter, which is the research, epidemiology and training arm of Médecins Sans Frontières, which, as you know, being in France, is the Nobel Prize-winning organization that provides acute medical care to people affected by war, natural disaster, or oppression. Her own focus is on the prevention of infectious disease in vulnerable populations, including vaccination response to epidemics and population-based studies on the effectiveness of prevention measures. So I think, Rebecca, you've got lots of civil society's perspective to bear here, that even in the preamble that we had before now, I think you've got some very interesting perspectives on how this plays out, and that maybe there may be an overemphasis on something like Ebola in the context of where that epidemic arises at the expense of other problems. But anyway, you talk.
Well, I think the first thing I wanted to say was to thank the organizers for including civil society in this meeting. And that's already a huge step forward and something which is critical to ensuring that vaccines are delivered to those that need it most. And so just to touch on a couple of things which were said previously, special populations or vulnerable populations are my world. That's our norm. And one of the things which is perhaps most important in ensuring that vaccines meet the needs of these populations is by including them in early stage development, as well as consulting both with civil society actors as well as the populations themselves. Because as Cormac mentioned, Ebola was clearly an international health disaster and one which touched many people. But at the same time that Ebola occurred, there were many children dying from rotavirus, from respiratory and tract infections, from respiratory infections, from an assortment of more banal, less sexy, less media-friendly diseases. And so our interest is ensuring that there's an ongoing dialogue both with manufacturers, with academics, with scientists, with civil societies, and most importantly with the populations themselves. And in order to do that, we would hope that the development and ongoing development of vaccines is not only just for emerging infections, but also to improve existing vaccines and to find ways that they can be delivered in a more adapted way. For example, looking at vaccines which can be delivered out of the cold chain, have lower packaging volume, and ones which respond to the needs that both mothers and their children and adults as well consider to be public health priorities in settings where they don't necessarily have access to everything that we here do. There's not necessarily an internet connection, nor is there access to clinical information, nor is there access to information about how vaccines can be useful and save lives.
And just to touch on what Danielle was saying as well, is vaccine hesitancy an issue in any of the vulnerable populations that you work with? Are people suspicious of vaccines?
I think people are suspicious of vaccines all over the world.
Yeah, it's no different.
But those are perhaps from different mechanisms, and so he mentioned that previously. There's kind of the wealthy public health hesitancy, which is rich people who use Google and who would like to make decisions. But in the populations that I work with, much of the hesitancy comes from fear about clinical medicine, a lack of understanding about how vaccines can be useful and save lives and provide a life-saving intervention, and also perhaps poor uptake and inclusion from people that matter most in the communities. It's a difficult subject, but it's important to remember that religious leaders, village leaders, and other representatives of societies are often gatekeepers to how vaccines are implemented, used, and integrated into a community. And it's extremely important to include them. Vaccines which are halal are an important thing to remember as well in many contexts.
And by the way, what are the kind of processes required for a halal certified vaccine?
I have absolutely no idea.
Okay.
I can tell you that it's very important, however.
Yeah. Actually, in my country, Ireland, halal processing of beef was a very nice niche for the industry. Maybe they might get into halal production of vaccines as well. It's quite interesting. When you talk about including populations, the sort of target population or vulnerable populations in the dialogue around product development, what do you mean by that and how can that be done?
Well, I think there's multiple ways to do that. I think the first thing is by ensuring that vaccines which are designed for vulnerable population and are destined for use, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, are actually trialed there by conduct of trials and the implication of those populations in the development itself. is also a way to refine that, to look at things that can be adapted before a label or a vaccine licensure is made, and that makes a huge impact. The second thing to consider is then in the preclinical and in the clinical stages of development, that these individuals and these population groups are not necessarily just considered special populations, but that the vaccine itself is trialed among them, and that the label then includes them. This is particularly important. We see that now even with Zika virus and development of hepatitis E in diseases that have vaccine candidates or licensed vaccines, which are specifically targeted to these populations. Where I work, most children are malnourished, and they're often excluded, and then that causes a difficulty later. And so by having these discussions and by ensuring that there is participation at multiple steps along the way, we hopefully can arrive at products which have better uptake, are easier to deliver, and also respond to public health needs of these populations.
Okay, and around Ebola then, which obviously was this big story last year in particular, and it continues to sort of rumble along, and some people in the West even sort of regard it as being a kind of a near success. There was actually just on this, there was a commentary in Nature Biotechnology, the current issue. I'm just going to read a paragraph from that. No vaccine, this is from Kendall Hoyt and Richard Hatchett. Kendall Hoyt is at Dartmouth, School of Medicine in Dartmouth, and Richard Hoyt is the acting director of BARDA, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. And they say no vaccine has ever been developed in time to change the course of an outbreak. Developers nearly caught up to Ebola in West Africa last year, but Ebola was a special case. US bioterrorism concerns have been fueling Ebola research for decades, and several vaccines and therapeutics were already under development. So in a sense, the sort of the fears of it being used as a weapon of terrorism, a bioweapon, kind of kick-started an effort that then was at least available to sort of piggyback on. And obviously, I think the most advanced vaccines are in phase 3. But what's your perspective on the sort of public health burden on Ebola? Because I've seen references to it imposing an enormous economic burden on the economies of the countries affected, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Mali. Not Mali?
Guinea.
Guinea, I beg your pardon. What, to put it in context, I mean, how important a burden on public health was Ebola versus other more everyday infectious agents?
Ebola is a unique situation,
okay.
And it's unique for many ways. It's unique because healthcare workers are affected, and that already changes the dynamics. It causes mass panic. It can be extremely scary. There's lots of Hollywood movies about viral hemorrhagic fevers. Rich people got affected. There were people all over the world that became very scared. There was a great deal of money injected into Ebola, which is not necessarily the case for other more banal public health priorities. But so I don't want in any way to denigrate from this experience, but want to point out two things. The first is we still don't have a licensed vaccine. And it's important to remember that this isn't over until that occurs, and it needs to be both a licensed vaccine, which has been demonstrated to be both safe and effective, and we're not there yet. The second aspect is, although there was this great investment put in it, our major concern now is ensuring that these lessons then progress into other public health priorities which may not receive the same attention. And that means touching on issues of trial design in terms of having more supple and fluid regulatory approvals, in terms of sharing information across partners, and in terms of remembering that problems in countries like Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia continue after everyone leaves. And Ebola has now, to some degree, fallen off the agenda and has been replaced by other emerging infections, which are extremely important. But what the risk we have now is that the process isn't completed. There's a great deal of work which is being conducted at the World Health Organization, among many other actors, in terms of a roadmap for R&D, but our biggest success out of this would be is if those lessons would transfer to diseases which don't necessarily have as much media attention.
Such as?
Well, you brought up rotavirus.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Rotavirus isn't a very sexy disease. It affects little kids, and and there are 2 WHO pre-qualified vaccines, but they are unfortunately not necessarily adapted to most populations. It would be great to work on those things. It would be great to have a pentavalent meningococc vaccine, a PCV vaccine with reduced dosage. I would hope that the work continues on dengue and on malaria vaccines, and that in no way that there's a dampening of all of those efforts. We have a significant yellow fever problem at the moment in Angola. There are many issues which require investment, of which manufacturers have been working extremely hard in order to ensure that, but it's not just manufacturers that can resolve the problem, it's both civil society, it's researchers, academics, and UN institutions that need to work together in order to improve that.
And what are the shortcomings of the current rotavirus vaccines in the context in which you work?
It's expensive.
Okay, yeah.
That's the first one, but it's not just about price, and sometimes that gets lost in these discussions about access isn't necessarily just a question of price, but it's also a question of being able to have a product profile which is easy to deliver to the populations that need it. So reducing storage volume, reducing cold chain constraints, and looking at flexible dosing schedules.
Okay, yeah. So it's just complex. And the technologies that are available and have been developed here in the West do not map neatly onto the problems that exist in the South.
I think they could.
Yeah.
Without that much difficulty.
Yeah, but right, as of now, they're maladapted, though.
They are, and that just necessitates more conversation and more discussion about how to improve that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much.